Good morning. I hope everybody's having a good day. I hope that everybody's looking forward to the weekend. And I hope that on Monday we get to start the play proper. When I first started planning for Major, I didn't plan for two of these kind of tangential background sort of lectures. However, because some of the stuff is in the textbook, it seems to me that I should kind of run through a few other things as we go here. Quick reminder, we're doing Measure for Major until the 26th. Alfonso will present on the 26th. We have a quiz. Paper 3, which is over the comedies, is due on the 30th. And paper 4, we'll talk about that. You already have the assignment, but I figured I would wait a little bit before I get into May. Preview for today, talk a little bit more about justice. We're going to mention the Bible. We're going to talk about Machiavelli, and we're going to talk about Foucault, and we're talking about them because of page 1322 in the book. And it was reading that passage and thinking that perhaps it's a little bit incomplete that I thought I would talk about Foucault and Machiavelli. I know I've mentioned Machiavelli before. I know I probably put a couple quotes from Machiavelli up on slides before. We're going to go through him one more time. If this is all repeat and I've got a lot of gray hair and forgotten everything I said, I apologize in advance. Justice. We talked in class about justice being the idea of rendering each person his due. There are some versions of justice that talk about treating equals equally and unequals unequally. I think it's important to remember that the basic idea of justice is an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And the eye for an eye comes from the idea that you don't kill someone if you only lost an eye. You don't take someone's eye if you only lost a tooth. And so, if a man has destroyed the eye of a man of the gentleman class, they may destroy his eye. If he has destroyed the eye of a commoner, he shall pay 1 mina of silver. In other words, the gentleman class, according to Hammurabi, is more important than the commoners. And if it's the eye of the slave, half the slave's price. So apparently eyesight is really important. But we are not dealing with a situation with Hammurabi that all are created equal by any stretch of the imagination. Unequals are treated unequally, but equals, eye for an eye. Leviticus talks about anyone who injures their neighbor shall be injured in the same manner. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The one who has inflicted the injury must suffer the same injury. The New Testament takes a little bit different twist on it. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Hence the title of the play, as your textbook tells you, Measure for Major. Shakespeare is pulling the Matthew passage out as part of the title. It makes me curious if he's trying to ask people to go back to an eye for an eye, if he is trying to fit the idea of don't judge because you're going to be in the same boat. I think it's something we need to take a look at. Also, I'm going to commit biblical studies without a license. I sometimes wonder if his goal shouldn't be Micah 6:8. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. And I copied and pasted this one, so I'm not sure what the A is doing there, but to walk humbly with your God. I don't know if the characters necessarily love mercy. There seems to be a few acts of mercy, The law says one thing is just. The mercy seems to work out here a little bit. I don't know if anybody is truly walking humbly. Maybe it should have been the goal. It's something to think about. Page 1332 talks about Machiavelli. I believe I mentioned him before in a couple of the plays. Machiavelli's goal always is the prince should keep power. If the prince keeps power, we don't have civil wars. If we don't have civil wars, citizens are better off, even if it's an oppressive government. Machiavelli also gives the prince a large amount of leeway when he goes through the how the prince should rule. All right? A prince should keep faith, live with integrity, and not with craft, not with double dealing, not with deceit. However, the great princes don't hold good faith into account, and they circumvent the will of men by craft. The second part of this passage is the idea that there's two ways to deal. One is by law, the other is by force. Law is proper to men, force is proper to beast, and the good prince does both. The good prince uses law, the good prince uses power, and the good prince, when necessary, is tricky. The good prince, when necessary, is crafty. I've got 3 highlights on this one. You don't keep faith if it can hurt you. People are bad, therefore you don't have to keep faith because they're not going to keep faith. And by the way, if you're the prince, you'll always have legitimate reasons not to keep faith. Always have legitimate reasons not to keep faith. Also, the prince should appear to have all the good qualities. In other words, the prince should appear to be merciful, faithful, humane, religious, and upright. And probably a good idea to be that way. But know when not to be that way. Know when to unleash the beast, for lack of a better phrase. Appear to have all the qualities. All right? And there are some Machiavellian elements within the play. When the Duke leaves, he says he's been too lenient. The person he puts in charge is too tough. And Machiavelli has a story about a prince who put a guy who was too tough in charge. He got the people in line. He went way too, the guy that the prince put in charge went too far. And all of a sudden, one morning, the people showed up and that guy had been beheaded. And it was just a reminder that the prince is still in charge. If you overstep your bounds, the bad guy is going to come back. But the prince has all of the power and he will use it. It seems to me that bits of this play follow that plot line a little bit as well. And it's necessary to have a mind to turn itself accordingly as the winds and variations of fortune force it. Don't diverge from the good, but if you're compelled, know how to diverge from the good. Keep order, keep power, know how to diverge from the good, be deceitful. And certainly, the leader of this, state, this city-state in this play, seems to know how to be deceitful, seems to know how to diverge from the good and, go through the city and hide his identity, work in disguises, put a tough guy in charge, those sorts of things. One of the things the book talks about is that Machiavelli says it is better to be loved, it is better to be feared than loved. The book said it, I didn't put the slide up. What the book doesn't mention is the prince must consider how to avoid those things which will make him hated or despised. I believe I talked about this next paragraph, or this next little excerpt in Macbeth. It makes him hated above all things, as I have said, to be greedy and to exploit the property and women of his subjects. Remember in Macbeth, that's what Malcolm said he would do. He would take all of the property, he would exploit all of the women. He must avoid doing this. The prince is supposed to avoid hatred, so that's number one, and he should avoid being despised, and that's number two. If he is changeable, foolish, weak, mean, as in, average, or not necessarily mean as in we use the term today, and uncertain. A prince should avoid these characteristics. He should show greatness, courage, seriousness, and strength. He should show his judgments must be followed, and that no one can hope to deceive him or get round him. The prince should be the fox. The prince should be the one that cannot be tricked. The book talks about Machiavelli. I thought it just went a little bit short, so I'm trying to add a few other things that I think tie into the play as well. The book also mentions Michel Foucault. And Michel Foucault did write the book about discipline and punishment, did write a lot of what the textbook talks about, the idea that in the, Measure for Measure lends itself to a Foucauldian reading with so many scenes either focused on public shamings or set in a prison. In this context, it is ominous, not comforting, that a disguised ruler spies on his people. And I think there's a couple more things to talk about with Foucault. Number one, the use of rational argument to support or oppose a political view, according to Foucault, is merely another attempt to exercise arbitrary power over others. Accordingly, he eschewed any blueprint for political reform or any explicit articulation of moral or rational norms that society ought to uphold. He argued that normativity was bad. And he argued, as you can see right above the bolded sentence, that any attempt to set one practice as moral or superior of the others should be skeptical. In a lot of ways, there's a touch of nihilism here. The punishment thing, where everybody was being watched, I think I just want to give you a little bit of detail. I talked about utilitarianism in a previous slide presentation. Jeremy Bentham was one of the founders of utilitarianism, and he talks about the idea of the panopticon. And the panopticon is one of the things that Foucault talks about in Discipline and Punishment as kind of what happens in society. Bentham has this idea that you have a perfect prison, all the cells are open to a central tower, and they're constantly confronted by the idea that the person in the tower can see them even though they can't see the person in the tower. And so they are acting as if they are always watched. And that creates a sense of behavior that Bentham thought would be beneficial. Foucault argues that at the societal level, it is terrible, and that is what happened in the 19th century. I believe he would argue that is what has continued to happen. And we now live in this panoptic machine. We are neither in the amphitheater nor on the stage, but in the panoptic machine, invested by its effects of power. And so if we're looking at the play, where people are publicly shamed, where people are always viewed in prison, Foucault would say that that's the world we're living in the 21st century, or 20th century, and I don't think it's changed in the 21st century. We bring ourselves, we are part of the mechanism. we are using the power of the panopticon as much as we are being subjected to the power of the panopticon. The implications: we internalize rules and regulations, and those come from the state. The implication of rehabilitation rather than cruel and unusual punishment: obviously, I think we can argue that the death penalty in the play is probably cruel. But he says that when we're talking about normal, we're enforcing a status quo in the more private portions of our lives. We're destroying privacy. That might be just as bad as the cruel and unusual punishment. More surveillance. And again, is the Duke surveilling in a way? We can argue about that and talk about that. The information society, all of the Facebook stuff, all of the Instagram stuff. Bureaucracy, we're turning individuals and statistics and paperwork. They're becoming means to an end rather than ends unto themselves, to use some of the terminology from Wednesday's presentation. Efficiency, we want everybody to get things done quickly, even if it exploits people, even if it leads to injustice. And we're going to be specialized, and we're going to rely on experts. For example, we have expert meat packers, or we have expert car mechanics, or we have experts doing things that people used to do all by themselves. Even in Shakespeare's time, people did a lot of the things themselves that we refer to experts now. And again, I think with Foucault, it's important to remember that I think the textbook is just a little benign on Foucault's idea that, we can't have norms, we can't have, a right from wrong, those sorts of things that are part of the implications of Foucault. Some of his other observations might be accurate, they might be important, but I don't know if the textbook gives us that. And so I do think the Foucault reading might be a little bit terrifying. Part of it might be accurate, but I think we have to look at Foucault in his entirety. And I have flattened a whole bunch of it here, but I think I've given you some necessary stuff that the textbook didn't. I hope everybody has a good weekend, and we will pick up with the play proper: character, conflict, connection, and theme. We'll pick that up on Monday.